They called me Silent Wings in the nights when the moon disappeared and the desert turned to ink. But at my father's 50th wedding anniversary, before 250 guests who smelled of expensive cologne and quiet judgment, I sat perfectly still while he stood beneath the crystal chandelier and introduced me as his greatest disappointment. The irony lived in the space between his words and the truth that would shatter his carefully constructed fiction in exactly 7 minutes. I knew because the man 4 tables away, silver-haired and decorated in Air Force dress blues, had just set down his champagne glass with the kind of deliberate care that precedes an earthquake. The Grand Hall in Great Falls, Montana carried sound the way cathedrals do, amplifying certain frequencies while swallowing others whole. My father's voice, bourbon smooth and practiced, rode those acoustics like he owned them. Perhaps he believed he did. Jonathan Mitchell, 86 years old and convinced that volume equaled authority, had spent 6 decades perfecting the art of filling rooms with his opinions. Tonight he wore a charcoal suit that strained slightly at the shoulders, a burgundy tie that Vivian had probably chosen, and the expression of a man who thought himself generous for acknowledging my existence at all. I let my hands rest in my lap, fingers loosely interlaced over navy silk. The dress had cost me $40 at a consignment shop in Billings. Simple, unremarkable, designed to take up the least possible space in a room that clearly had no intention of making room for me. My mother would have understood. Grace Mitchell had spent her entire marriage learning how to become smaller, quieter, less inconvenient. She died when I was 26, her lungs filled with the kind of poison that comes from breathing in places that don't want you to breathe deeply. Thank you all for celebrating with Vivian and me. My father's words floated above the centerpieces, above the white roses that cost $200 per arrangement, according to the invoice I'd glimpsed in the study earlier. I'm blessed with 2 children, Marcus, my son, who's doing quite well in tech consulting. 4 tables to my right, my brother ducked his head like a man trying to avoid sniper fire. Marcus Mitchell, 65 and soft in all the places our father was hard, knew the consulting job was fiction. He'd declared bankruptcy for the 4th time 3 months ago. I knew because Victoria Lawson, who handled estate law with the same precision surgeons use on hearts, had mentioned it during our phone call 2 nights prior. Victoria remembered things. She remembered my mother asking her to witness a trust fund signature in 1988. She remembered promising Grace Mitchell that her children would be protected. She remembered everything except how to reach me for 36 years, which meant my mother had asked her not to. Some silences are inherited, and Catherine, my daughter. My father paused, letting the name sit in the room like an uncomfortable guest. Kate is 62 now, never married, no children. The woman to my left, someone's wife wrapped in pearls and pity, shifted in her seat. I could feel her calculating my worth in the currency of social acceptability, finding me bankrupt. I kept my spine straight, my breathing even. In the cockpit, they teach you that panic is just oxygen moving too fast through a body that forgot how to trust itself. Slow the breath, steady the heart. Let the instruments tell you what's true when your gut is screaming lies. Kate spent 30 years working for the government, some kind of desk job, I think, paperwork, forms, that sort of thing. Laughter rippled through the room, polite and pitying. I recognized the sound. It was the same laugh that followed me through Cedar Ridge Elementary, when I showed up in my brother's hand-me-down jeans, because my mother's nursing salary couldn't stretch to cover both children equally. The same laugh that echoed in the high school cafeteria when I sat alone, too tall and too angular to fit into the spaces carved out for girls who understood how to be decorative. Some sounds never change their shape. They just find new rooms to haunt. She's retired now, living on government pension and some small flight instruction work. I help her out financially when I can. It's what fathers do. Vivian Cross Mitchell, 58, and wearing a sequined red dress that caught light like a traffic signal, touched my father's arm with manicured fingers. The gesture looked practiced, performed for an audience that wanted to believe in their love story. I wondered if she touched him differently when the cameras went dark, when the guests went home, when it was just the two of them, and whatever agreements they'd made about how to split the inheritance my mother left behind. Not everyone is meant for greatness. My father let the words land heavy, let them settle into the space between appetizers and entrees. Some people are just ordinary, and that's okay. We love Kate anyway, don't we, Vivian? Of course we do, darling. Her voice dripped sweetness cut with something sharper, something that tasted like triumph. I smiled. Not the grimace of someone swallowing humiliation, but the small, knowing curve that comes from holding information other people don't know they need. The smile I learned at 30,000 feet when the instruments disagreed with visibility, and I had to choose which truth to trust. The sky doesn't lie if you know how to read it. Neither do trust fund documents filed with the county clerk's office, accessible to anyone willing to spend 3 hours and $47 in filing fees searching public records. Emma Rodriguez sat 2 tables away, her dark eyes wide with the kind of outrage that comes from being 28 and still believing the world operates on fairness. She started to rise, her chair scraping against hardwood, her mouth opening around words that would only make things worse. I lifted my left hand 2 inches off the table, a gesture so small only someone watching for it would notice. Emma froze mid-motion, understanding flowing across her face like weather. I'd taught her that signal 3 months ago during a particularly turbulent landing simulation. Wait. Watch. Let the situation reveal itself before you commit to an action you can't take back. She sat down. Good. The man in Air Force Blues 4 tables away wasn't smiling anymore. Colonel Robert Sterling, 67 according to the program Vivian had printed on cream cardstock, had gone very still, in the way predators do before they move. I knew that stillness. I'd learned it in rooms where decisions got made about who lived and who became statistics in reports nobody read unless the numbers got too high to ignore. Silence settled over the room like snow, muffling the band's half-hearted rendition of something Sinatra had sung better 40 years ago. I let it sit. Silence is not absence. Silence is not weakness. Silence is the moment before the truth stops asking permission to exist. But I need to tell you how I got here, to this moment, to this table in this room where my father rewrote my history with the confidence of someone who believed his version was the only one that mattered. I need to take you back to Cedar Ridge, Montana, to a house that smelled like aviation fuel and disappointment, to a hangar where my grandfather taught me that the sky doesn't care about your gender or your father's expectations. It only cares whether you respect its rules. I was 8 the first time my father told me I looked like a boy who'd been assembled wrong. We were standing in the driveway, gravel crunching under his work boots. The Montana sky stretched overhead in that particular shade of blue that exists nowhere else on Earth. He'd just come home from the aviation maintenance shop where he spent 12 hours a day proving he understood machines better than he understood people. I was holding a wrench, the kind with the adjustable jaw that clicked when you turned it, trying to help fix the truck that spent more time broken than functional. "You're built like a scarecrow." He said it the way other fathers might comment on the weather, casual and certain. "Grace, why can't you put some meat on this kid?" My mother, Grace Mitchell, 38, and already learning how to disappear inside her own life, came out of the house carrying a basket of laundry. She was always carrying something, always moving from one task to another, like motion could protect her from having to stop and feel the weight of her choices. Nothing wrong with being tall, Jonathan. Tall's fine on a boy. On a girl, it just looks wrong. I didn't cry. Even at 8, I understood that tears were currency in our house, and my father had already decided I wasn't worth the investment. I put down the wrench, walked around the side of the house to the hangar where my grandfather spent his afternoons restoring vintage aircraft that would never fly again but deserved the dignity of looking like they could. Rosebud. That's what he called me. Had called me since I was small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. "You helping your dad?" "He doesn't want my help." My grandfather, Tom Mitchell, looked up from the engine cowling he was polishing with the kind of attention most people reserve for prayer. He had my mother's eyes, gray-blue and kind in ways that made you want to confess your secrets just to have someone hold them gently. "Well then, maybe you can help me. I need someone with small hands to reach this carburetor." I was 12 when he first took me up. Early summer morning, the kind where the air tastes clean and the light comes in sideways, painting everything gold. The Cessna 172 sat on his private grass strip. Blue paint faded to something closer to memory than color, but the mechanics underneath were sound. My grandfather didn't believe in pretty without functional. If it can't do the job, all the paint in the world won't matter. "You ready, Rosebud?" I nodded, too excited for words, too terrified to admit fear. The cockpit smelled like leather and fuel and possibility. My feet didn't reach the pedals. My hands barely wrapped around the yoke. But when we lifted off, when the ground fell away and the sky opened up around us like a promise nobody could take back, I understood something fundamental about myself. I was never meant to stay small. I was never meant to fit into the spaces other people carved out and called appropriate. I was meant to fly. You feel that? My grandfather's voice came through the headset, crackling with static and certainty. That's freedom, Rosebud. Up here, nobody can tell you who to be. You just are. We stayed up for 47 minutes. Long enough for me to learn the basics. Long enough for my father to notice the plane was gone. Long enough for the fight that came after to reshape the boundaries of what was permitted in our family. Jonathan Mitchell stood in the hangar doorway, backlit by afternoon sun, his shadow stretching long and accusatory across the concrete floor. You took my daughter up in that death trap? She's a natural, Tom. Got hands like a surgeon. She's 12. She's got no business in a cockpit. My grandfather set down his cleaning rag with the careful precision of someone choosing their battlefield. She's got more business up there than most pilots I've known, including you. The silence that followed had teeth. My father had washed out of flight school at 23, a failure he'd spent 6 decades trying to bury under achievements that didn't require him to trust anything he couldn't control from the ground. Every man has a wound. My father's just happened to be shaped like the sky. You do this again, Tom, and you won't see her at all. Understand? My grandfather looked at me, his expression carrying an apology too big for words. Then he nodded. I understand. But he taught me anyway, in secret, in the stolen hours before dawn, when my father slept off the bourbon that helped him forget all the things he couldn't fix. By 14, I could execute a crosswind landing. By 16, I knew emergency procedures better than most licensed pilots. By 18, I could fly anything with wings and an engine. And I understood that my grandfather was giving me the only inheritance that mattered. Not money, not land, not approval, just wings. Grace Mitchell died on a Tuesday in November, when the light was already failing, and the hospital smelled like industrial cleaner trying to mask something older and more honest underneath. Lung cancer, stage 4, metastatic. The doctors used words like aggressive and unfortunate, as if cancer cared about adjectives, as if mortality could be softened with the right vocabulary. I sat beside her bed in St. Mary's Hospital in Great Falls, holding her hand while machines beeped their mechanical prayers. My father stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot, his back to both of us. Marcus had called from California, promised to catch a flight, and we all knew he wouldn't make it in time. Some absences are louder than presence. Katie! My mother's voice came thin and raspy, borrowed from lungs that had forgotten their primary function. Don't cry. I'm not crying, but I was, silently. The kind of tears that don't ask for attention or demand comfort. Good. She squeezed my hand with strength she shouldn't have had left. Listen to me. You don't ever beg for respect. You don't ask for permission to be valued. You earn it by being worthy of it, and then you demand it because it's your right. Understand? I understand. There's money. From Grandpa Tom. Trust fund. Victoria Lawson has the papers. Don't let your father tell you different. That money is yours and Marcus's, promise me. I promise. She died 4 minutes later, her breath simply stopping like a sentence that ran out of words. The machines screamed their digital grief. Nurses came running. My father turned from the window, looked at my mother's body like she'd inconvenienced him one final time, and walked out of the room without touching either of us. 3 days after we buried Grace Mitchell in the Cedar Ridge Cemetery, under a headstone that read, "Beloved wife and mother," as if those were the only roles she'd ever occupied, I found the envelope. Brown manila, thick with documents, hidden in the false bottom of her nightstand drawer underneath a Bible she'd never read but kept because her mother had given it to her. Inside, trust fund papers, notarized and official, establishing an account worth $750,000 to be held in trust for Catherine Rose Mitchell and Marcus Jonathan Mitchell, with their father serving only as administrator, not beneficiary, until both children reached majority or the trustee's death, whichever came first. Victoria Lawson's business card was clipped to the front page. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, for Katie and Marcus. Don't let him keep this. This is from Grandpa Tom's life insurance. It's yours. I love you, my silent warrior. I took the papers to my father, found him in his workshop, bent over an engine that probably didn't need fixing, but gave him somewhere to put his hands that wasn't around the neck of his grief or his guilt or whatever it was he felt when he allowed himself to feel anything at all. Mom left a trust fund for me and Marcus. He didn't look up. That money's for taking care of me. Your mother knew I'd need support. The papers say different. They say you're the administrator, but we're the beneficiaries. You planning to lawyer up against your own father? His hands went still on the wrench, grease staining his fingers. You want the whole town knowing what kind of daughter you are? I want what Mom wanted me to have. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Fear. Not of me, but of what I represented. Proof that he'd failed. Proof that his wife had protected her children from him even in death. Proof that he was smaller than he'd spent a lifetime pretending to be. Get out of my house. His voice came quiet, which somehow made it worse than shouting. You want to be ungrateful? You do it somewhere else. I packed one suitcase. Clothes, my mother's photographs, my grandfather's logbook from his Navy days. At the door, I turned back. My father stood in the hallway, not looking at me, looking through me like I was already gone. You're right, I'm not ordinary. And that terrifies you, doesn't it? He didn't answer. I left. The recruiter in Billings didn't blink when I told him I wanted to fly. Women had been approved for combat aviation training for exactly 3 years. The military was hungry for pioneers, for people willing to test theories about capability and endurance, and whether anatomy determined destiny. I qualified on the physical, aced the written exams, scored in the 97th percentile on spatial reasoning and stress management. The flight school commandant at Pensacola, Florida, was a woman named Captain Sarah Brennan, who looked like somebody's favorite aunt and flew like somebody's worst nightmare. She stood in front of our incoming class of 47 candidates, 12 of them women, and delivered the orientation speech with the emotional inflection of someone reading a grocery list. Most of you will wash out, not because you're not smart enough or brave enough, but because you'll realize flying isn't actually what you want to do when the reality of it strips away the romance. For those of you who make it through, congratulations. You'll have earned the right to risk your life for a paycheck that won't cover your student loans and the eternal gratitude of people who'll forget your name 5 minutes after you save their asses. I didn't wash out. I learned to trust instruments over instinct, to understand that the horizon lies when you can't see it, to make decisions in seconds that other people got hours to debate. I learned that fear is just information, that exhaustion is temporary, that pain is a signal you can acknowledge and then set aside when the mission requires it. They called me Mitchell. Then they called me Colonel Mitchell. And then, after a night in Bosnia when the weather was impossible and the mission was mandatory and everyone else said no, they called me Silent Wings. March 17th, 1995. I flew 6 hours through conditions that violated every safety protocol in the manual. No visibility. GPS glitching. Radio cutting in and out like a conversation with God where God kept hanging up. 23 soldiers on the ground, surrounded, running out of ammunition and options. Every other pilot had looked at the weather radar and made the sensible choice. I looked at it and made the only choice that mattered. I didn't fire a single shot that night. Didn't need to. I just stayed, circled, watched. Let the enemy know that someone was paying attention, that the darkness wasn't empty, that their window of opportunity had a witness. By dawn, the weather cleared enough for extraction. 23 soldiers came home. One of them was Colonel Sterling's son. He found me afterward in the ready room, exhausted, and still shaking from 6 hours of adrenaline and precision. Wanted to say thank you. Wanted to know how I'd done it. I didn't do anything special, just refused to accept that impossible means no. That's when Sterling, then a captain, started calling me Silent Wings. Said I didn't need to announce myself, my presence did the talking. The name stuck. For 30 years it stuck, through deployments and commendations, and the slow climb through ranks that would have been faster if I'd been louder, more aggressive, more willing to perform certainty instead of simply being competent. I didn't go home. Not for Marcus's first wedding or his second or his third. Not for my father's 70th birthday or his 80th. Not when friends from high school sent Facebook messages asking whatever happened to that tall girl who used to fix cars. Cedar Ridge existed for me the way childhood exists for most people, as a place you reference but don't revisit, as a wound that scabs over but never quite heals clean. I retired at 62 with full honors, a pension, and the kind of reputation that opens doors and closes conversations. Moved to Billings, bought a small apartment overlooking the Yellowstone River, and took a job teaching flight at a civilian aviation school where nobody knew my history, and I preferred it that way. Emma Rodriguez showed up in my introduction to aviation class 6 months ago, nervous and determined in equal measure. 28 years old, undergraduate degree in biology, parents who wanted her to apply to medical school, and a dream she was terrified to speak out loud. I recognized that terror. It tasted like my own. We were practicing emergency landing procedures in the simulator, and she kept second-guessing her decisions, hovering her hand over the controls like she needed permission before trusting her training. What are you waiting for? I don't want to make the wrong choice. There's no wrong choice if you commit to it fully. Wrong is hesitation. Wrong is hoping someone else will tell you what to do. Make a decision and make it right by following through. But what if I crash? Then you crash. But you crash making a choice, not avoiding one. She failed her check ride 3 times. On the third failure, I found her in the hangar afterward, crying with the kind of desperation that comes from wanting something so badly you can taste it, and simultaneously convincing yourself you'll never deserve to swallow. Why are you crying? Because I failed. Because I'm not good enough. You're crying because you failed? Or because you're afraid of what other people will think about your failure? She looked up at me, mascara tracking down her cheeks, understanding starting to break through the grief. The sky doesn't care who you were before you got up there. It only cares who you are in the moment you're flying. And in that moment, you don't need anyone's permission to be excellent. You just need to be quiet enough to hear what the wind is telling you. 3 weeks ago, Marcus called. I was in the hangar, showing Emma how to properly inspect control surfaces for stress fractures. My phone buzzed against my hip. I didn't recognize the number, but I recognized the area code. Montana, Cedar Ridge. Kate, it's Marcus. I know, what do you need? Dad's having an anniversary party. 50th wedding anniversary. Mom's been dead for 36 years. He remarried, 10 years ago. Woman named Vivian Cross. She's asking for family to attend. I started to hang up. Kate, wait. His voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before, a crack in the careful distance we'd maintained for 3 decades. Something's wrong. Vivian, she's been having Dad sign papers. I don't know what exactly, but last month he signed over the deed to the hangar. And I think she's accessed the trust fund. The trust fund Mom left us? Yeah. I got a notification from the bank. Activity on an account I thought was dormant. When I called to check, they said Dad had authorized a transfer, as administrator. But, Kate, the paperwork says he can't do that without both our signatures. How much? $340,000, transferred to an LLC registered to Vivian. I was quiet for a long time, doing math. $750,000 in 1988, conservatively invested, would be worth close to $1.1 million now, minus $340,000, minus whatever else Vivian had already taken. I'll come to the party. Really? Really, what's the date? The drive from Billings to Cedar Ridge takes 3 hours if you obey speed limits and don't stop to confront memories. I took 4, pulling over twice to breathe through the tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with returning to a place that had spent my entire childhood teaching me I didn't belong. Cedar Ridge looked exactly the same and completely different. The hardware store where I used to buy parts for my grandfather still occupied the corner of Main and 5th, but the paint was fresh, and the sign advertised organic seeds and reclaimed wood. The diner where my mother sometimes took me for pancakes when my father worked late had become a coffee shop with Edison bulbs and a chalkboard menu. Progress, I suppose. Or just gentrification wearing nostalgia like a costume. The house sat where it always had, 2 miles outside town limits, surrounded by 40 acres of land that used to grow wheat, but now just grew whatever wild things claimed abandoned fields. Someone had painted it white. My mother had loved the pale yellow it used to be, said it looked like butter in the morning sun. The hangar behind the house now bore a sign, Cross Aviation Rentals, Vivian's business, built on my grandfather's legacy and my father's signatures. I sat in my truck for 15 minutes, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. A woman emerged from the house wearing designer jeans and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Vivian Cross Mitchell, 58 and surgically maintained, moved like someone who'd learned to monetize youth even after biology stopped cooperating. Catherine, Jonathan didn't think you'd actually come. I stepped out of the truck, straightened my jacket. It's Kate. Oh, honey, the anniversary party is formal. You did bring something appropriate? I brought what I need. Dinner that evening was theater disguised as family bonding. The dining room table, which used to be covered in my mother's embroidered tablecloth and mismatched dishes, now displayed what looked like a catalog photo of wealthy people playing house. White plates, crystal glasses, silverware that matched. Vivian had erased every trace of Grace Mitchell and replaced her with expensive good taste. My father sat at the head of the table, older than I remembered, more fragile, but still carrying himself like a man who expected deference. He looked at me the way you look at furniture that used to be in a different room, familiar but contextually wrong. It's been a while, 14 years since Mom's funeral. You're still teaching those flying lessons? I am. Vivian set down a platter of something elaborate and unnecessary. Such important work, helping tourists see the sights. I'm sure it's very fulfilling. I smiled, didn't correct her, let her keep her assumptions. Some battles you win by refusing to fight them. After dinner, claiming a need for the bathroom, I walked past the study. The door was ajar, light spilling into the hallway. Vivian's voice carried sharp and urgent through the gap. Yes, I need you to finalize the paperwork before she starts asking questions. 1.1 million in the trust fund. Jonathan signed the consent form last month. No, Marcus is manageable, Kate, I'm not sure about. But she abandoned this family for 36 years. No court is going to side with her. I stood perfectly still, memorizing every word, every inflection. Evidence is just information organized correctly. I'd learned that in intelligence briefings where knowing how to listen mattered more than knowing how to speak. That night I called Victoria Lawson. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of a lawyer who knew trouble when it called after hours. Katie Mitchell. Lord, I thought I'd never hear from you again. I need information about a trust fund. Established in 1988, Grace Mitchell. I know the fund. I witnessed your mother's signature. She made me promise the money would be protected for you and Marcus. Can Vivian Cross Mitchell access it? Absolutely not. That fund is designated specifically for you and your brother. Your father is trustee, which means he has administrative oversight, but he cannot authorize withdrawals without signatures from both beneficiaries. Any transfer without your explicit consent would constitute fraud. What if he's already transferred money? Then you have grounds for legal action. But Katie, you'll need proof. Bank statements, transfer records, something concrete. I'll have it by tomorrow. The anniversary party invitation said formal attire, 6 p.m. arrival, dinner and dancing to follow. I wore a navy dress I'd bought at a consignment shop, simple enough to be invisible, expensive enough not to look cheap. No jewelry except my grandfather's pilot watch, scratched and functional and worth more than everything Vivian was wearing combined, if you measured value in memory instead of carats. The Grand Hall sat on the north edge of Great Falls, one of those venues that rented dignity by the hour to people who needed witnesses for their success. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, enough white linen to upholster an entire wedding industry. 250 guests milled around clutching champagne and small talk, most of them strangers to me, all of them part of the life my father had built, after deciding I wasn't worth including. Emma found me near the entrance, her dark eyes scanning my face for instructions. She wore a green dress that brought out the stubborn set of her jaw, the determination I was still teaching her to trust. You okay? I'm exactly where I need to be. Your dad, he's really gonna do this? Just pretend you're nobody? He's been pretending that for 62 years. Why stop now? The speeches started at 7:30, after appetizers and before the main course. Standard format: welcome, gratitude, toasts to the happy couple. My father stood beneath the chandelier in his expensive suit, looking like a man who'd earned the right to rewrite history because nobody had bothered to fact-check his version. And that's when he said it, all of it. Every dismissal, every reduction, every careful word designed to make me smaller so he could feel bigger. I sat and smiled and waited, because silence isn't weakness when you're holding all the cards nobody knows you've been dealt. I smiled because 4 tables away, Colonel Robert Sterling had just recognized my face, and the truth was about to stop asking permission to exist. Colonel Robert Sterling stood in the center of the grand hall, with the posture of a man who'd spent 40 years convincing younger soldiers that authority didn't need volume. His dress blues carried ribbons I recognized even from 4 tables away: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Distinguished Flying Cross. The room had gone so quiet I could hear champagne bubbles breaking their tiny contracts with physics. "Excuse me, Mr. Mitchell," Sterling's voice carried without effort, each syllable calibrated to fill space without demanding it. My father turned, still holding his champagne glass, still wearing the expression of someone who believed himself untouchable. "Yes, Colonel. You just said your daughter worked a desk job for 30 years? That's right, government work. Nothing special." Sterling walked forward slowly, his shoes clicking against hardwood in a rhythm that sounded like a metronome counting down to detonation. "I need to clarify something, because either you're misinformed or you're lying to 250 people who deserve better." The gasp came from multiple tables simultaneously. Vivian's hand flew to my father's arm, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric like talons. "I beg your pardon?" My father's face flushed the particular shade of red that comes from bourbon and wounded pride mixing badly. "Your daughter didn't work a desk job." Sterling stopped 10 feet from my father, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to keep the entire room in his peripheral vision. "She flew combat missions, 4,200 hours in hostile airspace, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria." The room tilted, not physically, but in the way collective understanding shifts when information rewrites context. People leaned forward. Silverware stopped moving. The band had abandoned their instruments entirely. "That's absurd. Women can't—" My father started, then stopped, realizing mid-sentence that the argument belonged to a different decade. "Women couldn't. Until 1993. Your daughter was one of the first 12 accepted into combat aviation training. She graduated top of her class." I remained perfectly still, hands folded, breathing even. This was Sterling's moment, not mine. Silence is knowing when to let other people carry truth for you. March 17th, 1995. Bosnia. Sterling's voice dropped lower, more intimate, forcing the room to strain toward him. My son's unit was pinned down in the Posavina corridor, surrounded. No air support available because the weather made flight impossible. Every pilot in the region refused to take off. He paused, letting the weight of that refusal settle. Except one. She flew 6 hours through conditions that violated every safety protocol we had. Didn't fire a shot, didn't need to. She just stayed, watched, made sure my son and 22 other soldiers knew they weren't alone in the dark. Vivian whispered something urgent to the man beside her, the lawyer she'd brought as her +1. He shook his head, equally confused about how to navigate terrain that had shifted beneath them. "They call her Silent Wings." Sterling looked directly at me for the first time. "Because she doesn't announce herself. Her actions do the talking." He crossed the remaining distance to my table and came to attention. The salute he gave me was crisp, perfect, carrying 3 decades of respect compressed into a single gesture. "Colonel Mitchell, it's an honor to see you again." I stood, returned the salute with the same precision. "Colonel Sterling, the pleasure is mine." The room erupted. Standing ovation, the kind that starts scattered and builds until everyone joins because remaining seated becomes its own statement. I watched my father's champagne glass slip from his fingers, watched it fall in slow motion, watched it shatter against the floor in a spray of crystal and expensive wine that looked remarkably like the blood we never talk about at parties like this. Vivian's face had gone the color of typing paper. Marcus stared at his plate like it held answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. Emma stood with tears streaming down her face, clapping so hard her hands had to hurt. I let the applause continue for exactly 15 seconds. Then I raised one hand, palm out, and the room fell silent again. The speed of that silence told me everything I needed to know about power. It doesn't come from volume or insistence. It comes from being the person others stop to hear. "Thank you, Colonel Sterling, but tonight isn't about me." My voice carried calm and clear, no emotion wasted on performance. It's about celebrating my father and Vivian's anniversary. I picked up my clutch, a small navy bag that matched my dress and cost $8 at the same consignment shop. I wouldn't want to take away from their special moment. The irony landed exactly where I'd aimed it. Several people coughed. Someone dropped a fork. The woman in pearls who'd been calculating my worth 30 minutes ago now looked at me like I'd appeared from thin air. "I'll be excusing myself now. Congratulations on your anniversary." The walk from my table to the exit took 47 steps. I counted each one, not from nervousness, but from habit. Situational awareness is just counting things that matter. My heels clicked against marble. My spine stayed straight. My smile remained small and private, the smile of someone who just moved the first piece in a very long chess game. Emma caught up with me in the parking lot, her green dress catching wind that smelled like rain coming. She was breathless from running, from crying, from the adrenaline of watching someone she admired refuse to perform humiliation. That was incredible. Her voice shook with something between joy and fury. Did you see his face? Did you see everyone's face? I unlocked my truck, old and reliable, and utterly unconcerned with status. I saw. Aren't you angry? How can you be so calm? Because anger is expensive, Emma. My grandfather's pilot watch caught streetlight, its scratched face reflecting 40 years of missions that mattered more than this moment. And I learned a long time ago not to spend resources I might need later. But he humiliated you in front of everyone. Number one, I opened the truck door, tossed my clutch onto the passenger seat. He tried to humiliate me. There's a difference. Humiliation requires my participation, and I chose not to attend. What happens now? Now I go back to my hotel. Tomorrow I have a meeting with a lawyer. Next week I reclaim what my mother left me. And in between, I sleep well because I know who I am. And he's still trying to convince other people who he wishes he were. Emma nodded slowly, processing. Can I ask you something? Of course. Of course. How do you do that? Stay so controlled when everything in you must be screaming? I looked at her, really looked, seeing past the mascara and the dress to the pilot she was becoming. The same way you land in crosswind, you don't fight the conditions. You understand them, adjust for them, and execute your approach based on what is, not what you wish it were. Her laugh came surprised and relieved. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. But it is clear. And clarity, Emma, is the only advantage that actually matters. I drove to the Hilton on 10th Avenue, 8 miles from the Grand Hall, and 3 decades from the last time I'd slept within the city limits of Great Falls. My room was generic in the way all hotel rooms are, designed to be comfortable and forgettable. Beige walls, landscape art that looked like it came from the same catalog as every other hotel landscape, sheets with a thread count chosen by committee. I sat on the bed still wearing my dress and called Victoria Lawson. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. Katie, I heard about the party. News travels fast in this town. Good news or bad news? Depends on your perspective. Vivian just called me, threatening legal action if you pursue the trust fund. She seems to think I work for her. Do you? I work for justice, honey. And justice says that money belongs to you and Marcus, not to a woman who married a lonely old man and convinced him to sign away his children's inheritance. I need documentation. Everything you have on the trust, every transaction, every authorization signature. I'll have it ready tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., my office. One more thing, Victoria. The hangar, the one my grandfather built. Marcus said Vivian had Dad sign it over to her aviation rental business. That would require a quitclaim deed. Those are public record. I can pull it tomorrow. Check who notarized it, and check if there's a medical evaluation from that time period. You think he wasn't competent to sign? I think a man who forgets he gave the same speech twice in one dinner party might not be the most reliable witness to his own intentions. Smart girl. Your mother would be proud. My mother is dead because this town's hospital used asbestos insulation until 1987 and called it safe. I'm not looking for pride, Victoria. I'm looking for what's mine. I hung up before she could respond with sympathy I didn't need. Sympathy is just pity wearing nicer clothes. And I'd spent 62 years learning that neither one puts food on the table or justice in the bank. My phone buzzed. Text from Marcus. We need to talk. I typed back, tomorrow 8 a.m. coffee shop on Main Street. His response came immediately. Dad is furious. Vivian is worse. They're talking about contesting Mom's will. I smiled at the phone screen, at the desperation bleeding through autocorrect and poor punctuation. Let them talk. Talking isn't the same as doing, and doing requires evidence they don't have. Sleep came surprisingly easy. Exhaustion helps, but so does the particular peace that comes from finally being seen for who you actually are instead of who someone wished you weren't. I dreamed about my grandfather's hangar, about the smell of aviation fuel and possibility, about hands that taught me flight without requiring me to shrink first. The coffee shop that used to be Mel's Diner looked nothing like I remembered. The red vinyl booths had been replaced with reclaimed wood tables. The checkerboard floor was now polished concrete. The menu offered things like cold brew and oat milk, words that would have confused the waitress who used to serve my mother coffee so strong it tasted like regret. Marcus arrived 10 minutes late, disheveled in the way of men who've given up fighting time. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes carried bags that suggested sleep had become theoretical. He ordered something complicated involving almond milk and caramel, then sat across from me with the heaviness of a man carrying confessions. I didn't know. His first words came rushed, defensive. About the flying, about what you did. Dad never told me. Dad never asked. I sipped black coffee that tasted competent but unmemorable. There's a difference between not knowing and not caring enough to find out. That's not fair. Fair stopped being relevant when you called me 3 weeks ago only because you needed something. When was the last time you called just to see how I was? He looked at his coffee cup like it held the answer. Found nothing useful. I'm sorry. Apologies are easy, Marcus. They're just words that cost nothing and change less. I need to know if you're on my side or his. There aren't sides here, Kate. He's our father. He stole from us, from Mom's legacy, from the trust she set up specifically to protect us from exactly this situation. Marcus flinched. We don't know that for sure. I pulled out my phone, opened the photos I'd taken the night before. Bank statements showing $340,000 transferred from Grace Mitchell's trust fund to Cross Aviation Holdings, LLC. Authorization signatures that looked like my father's handwriting after 3 bourbons and a stroke. Vivian has been systematically draining everything Mom left us. The trust fund, the hangar, probably the house and land too, if we don't stop her. He stared at the photos, his face cycling through shock, denial, and the tired acceptance of someone who'd suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm. What do you want from me? I want you to come to Victoria's office at 9 a.m. and sign the paperwork necessary to freeze the trust fund pending investigation. I want you to request copies of every document Dad has signed in the past 10 years. And I want you to stop pretending that loyalty to a man who never valued you is more important than protecting what Mom died trying to give you. His hands shook slightly as he set down his coffee. You make it sound so calculated. It is calculated, Marcus. Calculation is just another word for caring enough to think things through. Mom did it when she set up that trust. Vivian's doing it every time she slides another document in front of Dad. The only person not calculating is you. And that's why you've declared bankruptcy 4 times, while pretending to run a tech consulting business that hasn't had a client in 3 years. The cruelty of truth hung between us like smoke. I hadn't wanted to hurt him, but I needed him awake. Needed him to understand that this wasn't a family disagreement that could be solved with awkward Christmas dinners and selective amnesia. How did you know about the bankruptcies? I'm a pilot, Marcus. My job was knowing things that other people thought were hidden. Reading terrain, reading weather, reading the 1,000 tiny signals that tell you whether you're heading into trouble or just borrowing someone else's fear. He nodded slowly, defeated. What time did you say Victoria's office was? 9 a.m. Don't be late. Victoria Lawson's office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building that had survived the town's various attempts at modernization by being too useful to tear down. The stairs creaked. The hallway smelled like old wood and copying toner. Her door wore frosted glass with her name in gold letters that were peeling at the edges. Professional enough to inspire confidence, but weathered enough to suggest experience. She stood when we entered, 72 years old and sharp as the letter opener on her desk. Marcus she greeted with a handshake. Me, she pulled into a hug that smelled like vanilla and determination. Your mother sat in that exact chair 36 years ago and made me promise something. Victoria released me, gestured to the leather chairs facing her desk. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd make sure you two got what she'd set aside. I'm ashamed it took this long to honor that promise. You didn't know how to reach me. I could have tried harder. She sat, opened a file folder thick enough to be a weapon. But I'm here now, and I brought documentation. The next 45 minutes were a masterclass in financial forensics. Victoria walked us through the trust fund's history, established 1988 with $750,000 from my grandfather's life insurance policy. Invested conservatively, managed by a firm in Billings, growing to $1.1 million by 2024. Then the withdrawals started. First in 2019, 1 year after Vivian married my father. $50,000, authorized by Jonathan Mitchell as trustee, marked medical expenses. Then another $75,000 in 2020, same justification. Then monthly withdrawals ranging from $5,000 to $15,000, all adding up to $340,000 transferred to Cross Aviation Holdings. I examined the authorization signatures. They degraded over time, getting shakier, less certain, looking less like intentional theft, and more like the confused scrawl of someone who'd forgotten why pens existed. These signatures. I pointed to the later ones. When did Dad get diagnosed? Victoria pulled another document from a different folder. Alzheimer's disease, early stage, diagnosed June 2020 by Dr. Patricia Hammond at Great Falls Medical Center. The diagnosis specifically recommends against making major financial decisions without oversight. But the withdrawals continued after that. Marcus leaned forward, finger tracing the timeline. Vivian kept having him sign even though the doctor said he shouldn't. That's called undue influence. Victoria's voice carried the satisfaction of a lawyer who'd found the crack in an opponent's armor. In Montana, if you can prove someone took advantage of a person's diminished capacity to extract financial benefit, every transaction can be voided. What do we need to prove it? Medical records showing his diagnosis and decline, bank statements showing the pattern of withdrawals, testimony from people who witnessed his confusion, and ideally, evidence that Vivian knew about his condition and exploited it anyway. I can get the medical records, Marcus volunteered. Dad put me as his secondary emergency contact. The hospital will release them to me. Victoria looked at him with new appreciation. That would be helpful. What about witnesses? I thought about the dinner 2 nights ago. The way my father had repeated himself. The way his eyes went distant mid-conversation. Emma had been there. Sterling had noticed. Even some of Vivian's friends had exchanged uncomfortable glances. I can get witnesses, but I want to do this correctly. No room for appeals, no technical errors that let her walk away clean. Victoria smiled, the kind of smile lawyers wear when they realize their client understands the game. Then we file for an emergency injunction freezing all assets pending competency evaluation. We request immediate audit of the trust fund. And we petition for removal of Jonathan as trustee on grounds of incapacity, replacing him with you and Marcus as co-trustees. How long? If we file today, hearing within a week, injunction likely within 48 hours. File it. Marcus signed the paperwork with shaking hands, each signature an acknowledgement that we were crossing a line our father had drawn 36 years ago. The line that said family loyalty meant accepting whatever narrative he constructed, even when that narrative erased us. When we finished, Victoria walked us to the door, her hand briefly touching my shoulder. Your mother used to say something I never understood until now. What's that? She said you were born knowing how to fly, even when your feet were on the ground. I think she meant you always knew when to rise above things and when to land precisely where you needed to be. Outside, the Montana sky stretched enormous and indifferent overhead. Marcus stood beside me on the sidewalk, looking lost. What now? Now we wait for the legal system to do what it does slowly but thoroughly. I checked my watch, the one my grandfather had worn through 2 wars, and given me the day I left for basic training. And in the meantime, I have a flying lesson to teach. Emma was waiting at the Billings flight school when I arrived that afternoon, early and nervous the way she always was before lessons. She'd changed out of the green dress into jeans and the flight school jacket, looking more like herself, more like the pilot she was becoming. We took up the Cessna 172, same model my grandfather had taught me in 40 years ago. The mechanics were different, the avionics more sophisticated, but the essential truth remained unchanged. Metal and physics and trust, all working together to defy gravity's honest attempt to keep you humble. At 3,000 feet, I handed her control. Practice your crosswind landings. She adjusted heading, compensated for wind, lined up her approach. Everything technically correct, but I could feel her hesitation through the yoke, the way she second-guessed each input. What are you thinking about? Whether I'm doing it right? Wrong answer. What should you be thinking about? The wind, the runway, the airspeed. Exactly. The only thing you control is your response to conditions. Everything else is just noise. She executed the approach, landed with a slight bounce, corrected, settled. Not perfect, but honest. On the ground, engine cooling, she turned to me with the question she'd been holding all day. What you did last night? walking out like that. How did you know it was the right move? I didn't. I just knew staying would have been the wrong one. Sometimes the best decision is just eliminating the worst options until only one path remains. But weren't you scared that people would judge you for leaving? Emma, people were already judging me. They judged me when I was 8 and too tall. They judged me when I was 22 and chose the military over staying home. They judged me last night when my father told them I was ordinary. Their judgment isn't my emergency. She absorbed that, nodded. I want to be like you, not afraid of what people think. I'm terrified of what people think. The difference is I don't let that terror make my decisions for me. Fear is just information. It tells you what matters. Then you decide if it matters enough to change course. My phone rang, Victoria's name on the screen. Judge granted the emergency injunction. All accounts frozen as of 1 hour ago. Vivian just called me screaming about her rights being violated. What did you tell her? I told her to get a lawyer because the one she brought to the party works for her aviation LLC and can't represent her in a case where that company's finances are under investigation. When's the competency hearing? Thursday, 10 a.m. You'll need to be there. Marcus, too. And anyone who can testify about Jonathan's mental state. I'll be there. That night, I sat in my Billings apartment looking out at the Yellowstone River. Dark water reflecting city lights in patterns that shifted with current. My phone buzzed constantly. Messages from people I hadn't heard from in decades, suddenly remembering we'd been friends. Requests for interviews from the Great Falls Tribune and the Billings Gazette. An email from a military publication wanting to profile pioneering women in combat aviation. I ignored all of it. Attention is currency, and I was saving mine for transactions that actually mattered. One message I did read came from Sterling. Proud to serve beside you then. Proud to stand with you now. If you need testimony about your father's behavior, I'm available. I replied, thank you. I'll let you know. Then I made a list, the way I used to make flight plans. Objective, resources, risks, contingencies. The objective was simple. Reclaim what my mother had protected, remove Vivian from power, and ensure my father spent his remaining years cared for by people who had his actual interests at heart. Resources, Victoria's legal expertise, Marcus's access to medical records, Sterling's testimony, my own credibility, and whatever goodwill last night had generated. Risks. Vivian might have resources I didn't know about. My father might refuse to acknowledge his condition. The judge might decide that family disputes should be settled privately rather than legally. Contingencies. If the legal route failed, I had other options. Public pressure, media attention. The kind of scrutiny that made people nervous about explaining their choices to audiences larger than dinner parties. Wednesday morning brought rain, the kind that turns Montana roads into mirrors and makes visibility theoretical. I drove to Cedar Ridge anyway, windshield wipers keeping rhythm with thoughts that wouldn't settle. The house looked smaller in daylight and weather. The white paint showed cracks. The porch sagged slightly on the left side. The hangar behind it bore Vivian's sign, but the building itself still carried my grandfather's fingerprints. His understanding that structures should be functional before they worried about being beautiful. I didn't knock. The injunction meant I had legal right to access property that was technically part of the trust estate pending resolution. The door was unlocked, which told me either Vivian was careless or she'd been expecting confrontation. She sat in what used to be my mother's reading room, now converted to an office with glass desk and designer chairs that cost more than function required. She'd been on the phone but hung up when I entered, her expression cycling through surprise, anger, and something that looked almost like respect. You can't just walk in here. Actually, as of yesterday afternoon, I can. Trust assets are frozen pending competency hearing. That includes this house. This is Jonathan's house. This is my grandfather's house, which passed to my mother, which she placed in trust for her children, with my father serving as trustee. Now that his competency is questioned, I have every right to inventory trust assets. Vivian stood, her designer jeans and cashmere sweater, somehow making her look more desperate rather than less. You have no idea what you're doing. Jonathan and I built a life together. I've cared for him for 10 years. You've cared for his assets for 10 years. There's a difference. He loves me. Maybe he does. But love doesn't give you the right to steal from his children. Her face flushed, anger finally breaking through performance. Your mother died and left him alone. He was lonely, broken, drinking himself to death. I gave him reasons to live. And in exchange, you took everything she'd protected. That's not love, Vivian. That's a transaction. You walked away! She moved around the desk, pointing at me with a finger heavy with rings my mother never owned. You abandoned him for 36 years. You have no right to judge how he chose to move forward. I didn't abandon him. He kicked me out for asking about money my mother left me. There's a difference between leaving and being expelled. The silence that followed had texture, filled with all the arguments she wanted to make but couldn't without admitting things she needed to keep hidden. The hearing is Thursday. I turn to leave. I suggest you bring documentation showing every withdrawal was legitimate medical expense. Because if you can't, the court will assume fraud, and you'll be explaining your choices to a criminal investigator instead of a family court judge. Wait, I stopped but didn't turn around. What would it take? Her voice had changed, dropped the performance, landed on something closer to honest negotiation. For you to walk away from this, to let it go. I turned slowly, looked at her, really looked. She was younger than I'd thought, probably closer to 55 than 58. Pretty in the way that required maintenance and money, scared in the way that people get when they realize the game they've been winning is about to change rules. I want the trust fund restored to its full value, $1.1 million. I want the hangar deed transferred back to the estate. I want my father evaluated by an independent physician and placed in appropriate care. And I want you to disappear from our lives completely. That's everything. Number 1. I walked closer, stopped 3 feet away. Everything would be charging you with elder abuse and fraud and letting you spend the next decade in Montana Women's Prison. This is me being generous because I don't have time to watch you suffer. I have a life to return to, and you're barely a footnote in it. Her hands shook. She tried to hide it by crossing her arms. I don't have $1.1 million. Then you'll sell the aviation business, liquidate whatever assets you acquired with stolen money, and you'll do it quickly because the alternative is much worse. I need time. You have until the hearing Thursday. After that, the court takes over and I stop caring what happens to you. I left her standing in my mother's reading room, surrounded by furniture bought with money she'd taken from children who were supposed to be protected. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing from the west, blue breaking through gray in the way Montana weather does. Brutal, then beautiful without apologizing for either. Marcus called as I drove back to Billings. Kate, Dad's asking for you. Asking or demanding? Asking, quietly, like he's confused about what's happening. Where is he? At the house. Vivian's with him. I'll be there in 20 minutes. My father sat in the living room that used to hold my mother's piano, and my grandfather's war medals, and photographs of a family that believed itself capable of love. Now it held modern furniture and abstract art, and the careful emptiness of people who'd replaced memory with design. He looked older than he had at the party, smaller, the kind of small that comes from reality finally catching up to fiction. Katie. His voice cracked on my name. They said you're trying to take the house. I sat across from him, kept my voice gentle. No, Dad. I'm trying to protect what Mom left us. The house, the hangar, the trust fund. Vivian has been taking money without permission. Vivian takes care of me. I know you believe that, but the numbers tell a different story. He looked at his hands, age-spotted and trembling. I'm confused a lot lately. Things don't stick the way they used to. I know. Did I really say those things at the party? Yes. About you being ordinary? Yes. He was quiet for a long time. I wanted you to be ordinary. Because if you were ordinary, I wouldn't have to feel like such a failure for not being extraordinary. The confession hung between us, honest and decades too late. I was never going to be what you wanted, Dad, but I was always exactly who I needed to be. Your mother knew that. Grace always knew. She tried to tell me. What did she tell you? That you were born with wings I'd never understand. That my job was to protect you while you learned to use them, not clip them because they made me uncomfortable. She was right. I know. He looked up, eyes watery but present. I'm sorry, Katie, for all of it. Apologies don't fix the past, Dad, but they might shape what happens next. What happens next? You get evaluated by a doctor. We figure out what care you actually need. And you let me handle the money situation, because that's what Mom wanted and what you're no longer equipped to do. He nodded. Vivian will be angry. Vivian will be gone, one way or another. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes Montana worth the winters. The courthouse sat on 5th Street, built in 1912 with marble and ambition, updated only enough to keep the plumbing functional and the heat adequate. Victoria met us in the hallway outside courtroom C, wearing a suit that meant business and carrying a briefcase that probably weighed more than most evidence. Marcus stood beside me, nervous but present. Emma had come too, sitting in the gallery as moral support and witness to what happened when silence finally chose to speak. Judge Patricia Henderson entered at precisely 10 a.m., gray-haired and severe in the way of judges who'd spent 40 years watching people lie about money. She reviewed the petition, the injunction, the medical records Marcus had obtained, and the bank statements Victoria had organized with the precision of someone who understood that justice was just math done correctly. Vivian's lawyer, hastily retained and clearly underprepared, argued that the withdrawals were all legitimate expenses related to Jonathan's care. Judge Henderson asked for itemized receipts. The lawyer couldn't produce them. Victoria presented Dr. Hammond's diagnosis, the recommendation against financial decisions, and the timeline showing Vivian had continued extracting money well after the medical advice had been documented. Then Sterling testified, described the party, my father's speech, the clear signs of confusion and repetition, described how someone with cognitive decline shouldn't be managing complex financial instruments or signing legal documents without oversight. The judge listened, made notes, asked pointed questions that suggested she'd seen this pattern before. Predatory spouses targeting vulnerable partners, extracting wealth under guise of care. At 11:15, she rendered her decision. Trust fund frozen pending full audit. Jonathan Mitchell removed as trustee, replaced by myself and Marcus as co-trustees. All transfers from the past 5 years subject to review and potential reversal. Vivian prohibited from accessing any trust assets or properties. Jonathan to undergo immediate competency evaluation by court-appointed physician. Vivian stood face white, hands shaking. "This isn't fair. I've devoted 10 years to that man." Judge Henderson looked at her with the expression of someone who'd heard every justification and found none of them convincing. "Then you should have receipts proving where the money went. Since you don't, the court assumes it went to you. You have 30 days to restore the funds or face criminal investigation for elder abuse and fraud." The gavel came down, final, absolute, the sound of justice being delivered in small increments because that's how justice actually works. Not dramatic, just thorough. Outside the courthouse, the November sun felt warmer than it had any right to. Victoria hugged both of us, promised to handle the paperwork for transferring assets back to proper ownership. Marcus looked stunned, like a man who'd expected to lose and couldn't quite process victory. Emma found me on the courthouse steps. "That was amazing. You won." Number 1. I looked back at the building, at the marble and flags, and the machinery of justice that ground slowly but kept grinding. My mother won. She set up protections 36 years ago because she knew this might happen. I just had to be patient enough to let her plan work. What happens to your dad? He gets evaluated, gets the care he needs, and hopefully spends his last years with some dignity intact. What happens to Vivian is between her and the choices she made. And you? I go back to Billings, back to teaching, back to my life. That's it after everything? Emma, the goal was never revenge. It was restoration. Getting back what was taken, protecting what remains, and making sure the people who caused harm can't do it again. That's done. Everything else is just noise. She nodded slowly, understanding settling over her features. When do I get to be that calm about things? When you've flown through enough storms that you stop being surprised by turbulence. Until then, just keep your hands steady and trust your instruments. I drove back to Billings that afternoon, the road unwinding ahead of me in gray asphalt and white lines. Behind me, Cedar Ridge grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared into landscape. Ahead, the Yellowstone River Valley opened up, familiar and indifferent and honest about both. My phone buzzed. Text from Marcus. "Thank you for not giving up on this." I replied, "I didn't do it for Dad. I did it for Mom, and for the version of me who needed to know that silence isn't the same as surrender." Because that was the truth I'd carried for 62 years. Through cockpits and combat zones and all the rooms where people had tried to make me smaller. Silence is not weakness. Silence is the space between thought and action, the moment when you decide which battles matter enough to fight and which ones you win by simply refusing to participate in someone else's fiction. My mother understood that. She'd lived it through a marriage that tried to diminish her, through illness that tried to silence her, through death that tried to erase her. But she'd left behind protection, had planned for futures she wouldn't see, had trusted that eventually someone would care enough to execute her careful preparations. I was that someone, not because I was special or extraordinary or any of the things my father had insisted I wasn't, but because I was patient enough to let time reveal truth, and stubborn enough to demand that truth be honored. The sun was setting by the time I reached my apartment, turning the river below into liquid copper. I stood at the window watching light fade, thinking about all the flights I'd flown, all the nights I'd kept watch while others slept, all the quiet victories that never made headlines but mattered anyway. Tomorrow I would teach Emma about instrument flying. Next week I would sign the papers, making me co-trustee of my mother's carefully protected legacy. Next month I would probably attend my father's competency hearing and help arrange whatever care he needed. But tonight, I was just a woman standing in an apartment that held exactly as much as I needed and nothing more. No excess, no performance, no fiction. Just the truth of who I'd always been. Finally acknowledged by the only people whose opinion had ever actually mattered. My mother, who'd believed in me enough to protect me from beyond the grave. My grandfather, who'd taught me that freedom lives in the sky. And myself, who'd learned that the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to shrink just because someone else needs you smaller to feel bigger. The phone rang one more time, Sterling's number. I answered. Colonel, just wanted to make sure you're okay. Today was a lot. Today was necessary. There's a difference. Fair enough. His voice carried the warmth of someone who'd seen me at my worst and still thought I was worth standing beside. If you need anything, you know where to find me. I do. And Sterling, thank you. For the party, for the testimony, for remembering when everyone else forgot. Some people are worth remembering, Colonel Mitchell. You're one of them. We said goodbye, and I set the phone down, returned to the window and the river and the gathering dark. Somewhere in Cedar Ridge, my father was probably confused about why his wife couldn't access their accounts. Somewhere in Great Falls, Vivian was probably calculating whether 30 days was enough to liquidate assets and disappear before criminal charges landed. I didn't care about either scenario. My job was done. The rest was just consequences flowing downhill the way water does. Finding level, seeking truth. I'd spent 36 years being Silent Wings, flying missions that mattered, protecting people who needed watching, proving that quiet competence beats loud performance every single time. Now I was just Kate Mitchell again, retired colonel and flight instructor, daughter of a woman who'd loved fiercely, and a man who'd loved poorly, granddaughter of someone who'd understood that the greatest gift you can give someone is wings, and the faith they'll learn to use them. The river kept flowing, the sun kept setting, and I kept standing there, exactly where I needed to be, exactly who I'd always been, finally visible to everyone who'd spent decades insisting I was invisible. 3 weeks after the courthouse, winter arrived in Montana the way it always does, without permission or apology. Snow fell overnight, covering Cedar Ridge in white that made everything look cleaner than it deserved. I drove out from Billings on a Tuesday morning to meet the care coordinator at Meadowbrook Memory Center, the facility Marcus and I had chosen for our father after the court-appointed physician confirmed what we'd already known. Alzheimer's, progressive, requiring supervised living. The building sat on the eastern edge of town, modern and deliberately cheerful in the way places designed for forgetting always try too hard to be memorable. Pale yellow siding, flower boxes waiting for spring, windows large enough to let in light, but not large enough to make residents feel exposed. Inside, it smelled like coffee and industrial carpet, and the particular kind of patience required when time becomes circular instead of linear. Jonathan Mitchell had been there for 2 weeks, long enough to stop asking when he could go home, not long enough to accept that this was home now. I found him in the common room, sitting by a window overlooking bare trees and frozen ground. He wore a cardigan I didn't recognize, probably purchased by staff who understood that dignity sometimes means dressing people in clothes that fit their current life rather than their past. Katie. His face brightened with recognition that would last maybe 10 minutes before resetting. You came. I told you I would every Tuesday. Did you? He looked genuinely confused. I don't remember that. That's okay, Dad. I sat in the chair beside him, set my purse down. How are you feeling today? Tired. He gestured vaguely toward the window. Grace loved snow. She used to make me come outside and build snowmen even though I hated being cold. She did love snow. Is she coming today? His eyes held hope mixed with the kind of fear that comes from knowing you've forgotten something important, but not knowing what. No, Dad, Mom died 36 years ago, remember? The hope drained away, replaced by grief that felt fresh because for him it was. Every time he forgot and remembered again, he experienced her loss anew. Some cruelties are structural, built into biology rather than intent. Right, he nodded slowly. I keep forgetting. That's why I'm here, isn't it? Because I forget. That's part of it. Vivian said I'm here because you put me here, that you wanted to steal from me. I kept my voice level, neutral. Vivian isn't allowed to visit anymore, Dad. The court said so, and I didn't put you here to steal anything. I put you here so you'd be safe and cared for properly. He studied my face like he was trying to read a map where the landmarks kept shifting. You were a pilot. Someone told me that. Were you really? Yes, for 36 years. Why didn't I know that? Because you never asked. And because I stopped trying to tell you. A nurse appeared with the medication in a small paper cup. Jonathan took the pills obediently, swallowed them with water, thanked her with the automatic politeness of someone who'd been raised to respect service workers. When she left, he turned back to me. I wasn't a good father, was I? The question landed without warning, cutting through confusion to something clearer underneath. No, Dad, you weren't. I wanted to be, I just didn't know how. Wanting doesn't count for much when the actions go the other direction. He absorbed that, nodded. Your mother tried to teach me. She said love wasn't about control, it was about creating space for people to become themselves. I didn't understand that until it was too late. Understanding late is better than never understanding at all. We sat in silence while snow continued falling outside. Other residents moved through the common room, some with visitors, some alone, all of them existing in their own private timelines, where past and present blurred together like watercolors left in rain. The care coordinator, a woman named Helen, who wore scrubs patterned with cartoon birds, found me as I was leaving. Ms. Mitchell, could we talk briefly? Her office was small and efficient, decorated with family photos that probably weren't her family, but made the space feel less institutional. She gestured to a chair. Your father's adjusting well, all things considered. He asks about his wife regularly, and about someone named Vivian. We've been explaining the situation, but obviously retention is an issue. I understand. Has he been difficult? No, quite cooperative, actually. But there's a financial matter. His long-term care isn't covered by standard insurance. We'll need to establish payment arrangements. I'd anticipated this. Pulled out the folder Victoria had prepared. The trust fund will cover his care indefinitely. I've set up automatic payments from the estate account. You should have received the first transfer last week. We did. Helen looked relieved. I just wanted to confirm there wouldn't be disruptions. We've had situations where family members promise support but then disappear when the bills come due. I won't disappear. Even if he forgets I was here, I'll keep coming. That's the difference between him and me. I remember my obligations. Back in Billings, Emma was waiting at the flight school with news that had her practically vibrating with suppressed energy. She'd passed her commercial pilot exam. All of it. Written, practical, check ride. Perfect scores on everything except the parallel parking of a Cessna, which she'd executed adequately, but not elegantly. I'm certified. Her grin could have powered the entire facility. I can actually get paid to fly now. Congratulations. I meant it. Felt the particular pride that comes from watching someone learn what you taught them and then exceed it. What's next? There's a regional carrier looking for first officers, based out of Denver, serving smaller Montana towns. I applied, and they want to interview me next week. She paused, excitement dimming slightly. But they asked for references. Professional pilots who can vouch for my skills and character. I'll write you one tonight. Email me the details. Just like that? Emma, I've been watching you fly for 6 months. I've seen you handle emergencies, make decisions under pressure, and land in conditions that would make experienced pilots nervous. You're ready. The only question is whether you believe it. Her eyes went wet. Thank you. For everything. For teaching me that being quiet doesn't mean being weak. For showing me that you can be strong without being loud about it. The strongest wings are the ones that don't need to announce they're flying. Remember that when you're up there making decisions nobody else will understand until later. 3 days later, Victoria called with an update that carried satisfaction like spices through soup. Vivian had settled. returned $800,000 to the trust fund through liquidation of Cross Aviation Holdings and various personal assets. The remaining $300,000 she claimed to have spent on legitimate expenses, though the receipt suggested otherwise. Victoria had negotiated rather than fight, calculating that getting most of the money back quickly mattered more than punishing every transgression. She's left Montana. Victoria's voice carried the finality of doors closing. Moved to Arizona, changed her name legally. As far as Cedar Ridge is concerned, Vivian Cross Mitchell never existed. Good. There's one more thing. The hangar. Now that it's back in the estate, you and Marcus need to decide what to do with it. What does Marcus want? He wants you to have it. Says he has no use for it and you're the one who actually knows how to fly. I sat with that for a moment, thinking about my grandfather's hands building that structure, about all the hours I'd spent there learning that metal and physics could create freedom. Tell Marcus I'll buy his half. Fair market value. He needs the money more than I need charity. That's generous, Katie. It's practical. He's my brother and he showed up when it mattered. That's worth something. The paperwork took another week. Legal documents moving through systems designed for deliberation rather than speed. While bureaucracy ground forward, I taught my classes, flew my routes, existed in the rhythm of a life that had become mine through persistent refusal to be anyone else. December brought Christmas decorations to Billings, strings of lights that turned ordinary streets into something that aspired toward magic. Emma got the job with the regional carrier, start date in January. She took me to dinner at an Italian place downtown to celebrate, insisted on paying despite being 3 months away from her first paycheck. I need to tell you something. She set down her wine glass, serious suddenly. About why your story mattered so much to me. You don't owe me explanations, Emma. I know, but I want you to understand my parents. They're good people. They love me. But when I told them I wanted to fly instead of going to medical school, my father said women pilots were just diversity hires, that I'd never be taken seriously, that I should stick to something more appropriate. The old script, different actors, same lines. I almost believed him, almost gave up and applied to pre-med programs. But then I found your class, and I watched you just exist. Not arguing, not proving anything, just being exactly who you were with complete certainty. And I realized that's the answer. You don't fight people who underestimate you. You just become undeniable. That's harder than fighting. Fighting gives you something to push against. Being undeniable requires you to trust yourself completely, even when nobody else does. How did you learn that? By failing at the alternative for 22 years. I spent my entire childhood trying to convince my father I was worth his approval. It never worked because the problem wasn't me. It was his need to believe I was small so he could feel bigger. Once I understood that, I stopped auditioning for a role I was never going to get. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, smiled. My mom, asking how dinner is going. Are you going to tell her about the job? Already did. She cried. Happy tears, she says, but I think they're complicated tears. Pride mixed with worry, mixed with letting go. Those are the hardest kind. The ones that mean something's changing and you can't control how it changes. Did your mom cry when you joined the military? I don't know, I wasn't there. I left before she could react because I was afraid her sadness would make me doubt myself. That's one of my regrets. I should have stayed long enough to let her be sad, to honor that her feelings mattered even if they couldn't change my decision. It's not too late to honor that. My mother's been dead for 36 years, Emma. I meant you could honor it by letting other people be sad when you leave, by not always disappearing before the feelings get complicated. She was right, and the rightness of it sat uncomfortable. I'd spent 6 decades perfecting the art of leaving before anyone could leave me first. Strategic distance masquerading as strength. I'll work on that. January arrived with cold that turned breath to visible proof of life. Emma started her new job, texted me photos from her first official flight. The cockpit view from 30,000 feet, clouds like cotton batting below, sky above so blue it hurt. The caption, learning to trust my wings. Thank you for teaching me they existed. Marcus called mid-month. Kate, Dad's asking for you. Not just asking, insisting. Says he has something important to tell you but won't tell the nurses what it is. I drove out that afternoon, found my father agitated in a way the staff said was unusual. He grabbed my hand when I sat down. his grip surprisingly strong for someone whose mind was leaving in pieces. Katie, I remembered something important. What did you remember, Dad? Your mother, Grace. She made me promise. The day before she died, when it was just us for 5 minutes and the nurses were out of the room. Promise what? That I'd tell you she was proud, that she knew you were going to do amazing things and I should stop trying to prevent them, that loving you meant letting you go, even though it terrified me. He stopped, breathing hard from the effort of pulling memory through fog. She made me swear I'd tell you that, and I never did. Not once in 36 years. I forgot, or I was angry, or I was too proud to admit she'd been right about you and wrong about me. The confession hung between us, complicated by the knowledge that tomorrow he might forget this conversation entirely, and we'd be back to discussing weather and whatever breakfast tasted like. Thank you for telling me now. Does it matter that I waited so long? It matters that you told me it all. Some truths are late, but still true. She loved you so much, Katie, more than she loved me, I think. Not because you were better, but because you never asked her to be smaller. You just let her be who she was. I loved her too. I love her still. When I left, Helen stopped me again. Your father's been much calmer since you arrived. Whatever you talked about, it helped. We talked about my mother, about promises kept and broken. He talks about her constantly. Sometimes he thinks she's still alive. Sometimes he remembers she passed. It must be hard, losing her over and over. It is. But it's also practice for losing him. By the time his body gives up, his mind will have already taught me how to grieve in installments. That's a beautiful way to think about something awful. Grief doesn't ask permission to be beautiful. It just is what it is. February brought Emma's first emergency. Engine trouble over the Beartooth Mountains. Forced landing at a tiny regional airport outside Red Lodge. She called me from the tarmac, voice shaking but controlled. I remembered what you said, about fear being information. The engine started making a noise it shouldn't make, and instead of panicking, I just started running through the checklist. Found the nearest suitable airport, declared emergency, executed the approach exactly how you taught me. Anyone hurt? Just my pride. The landing was ugly, bounced twice before settling. Ugly landings that everyone walks away from are infinitely better than pretty ones that kill people. You did exactly right. The airline's sending someone to investigate. They might ground me pending review. Let them investigate. You followed procedure, made safe decisions, prioritized passenger safety over looking good. That's literally the job description. She laughed, relief bleeding through. How do you make everything sound so simple? Because most things are simple once you remove the emotional complications. The plane was broken. You landed it safely. Everything else is just people's opinions about your choices. And those don't actually matter unless you decide they do. 3 weeks later, she was cleared, commended actually for textbook emergency procedures. The airline put her story in their safety newsletter as an example of proper protocol under pressure. She sent me the article with a note. They called me Silent Wings Jr. I'm taking it as a compliment. March arrived with thaw, turning snow to mud and roads to obstacle courses. I received notice that the legal proceedings against Vivian had concluded. No criminal charges filed in exchange for the financial settlement, and permanent departure from Montana. Marcus had signed off on the agreement. I did too, more interested in moving forward than punishing backward. The hangar deed transferred to my name on a Wednesday. I drove out to look at it properly for the first time in 34 years. The structure had aged but held. Metal siding weathered but sound. The basic bones still strong because my grandfather had built things to last. Inside, dust covered everything. Old tools, spare parts, maintenance logs written in handwriting I recognized. The Cessna 172 my grandfather had taught me and sat in the back corner, covered in a tarp that had probably been there since he died. I pulled the tarp away, found the plane in surprisingly good condition. Someone had maintained it, probably my grandfather, right up until his heart gave out doing the work he loved. The logbook was tucked in the cockpit. I opened it carefully, pages brittle with age. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before he died. Took Rosebud up today. She's ready for anything the sky throws at her. I won't live to see where she flies, but I know she'll go higher than any Mitchell ever dreamed possible. I sat in the pilot's seat, hands on the yoke that his hands had touched, breathing air that still smelled faintly of aviation fuel and possibility. This was inheritance, not money, not land, but belief. Belief that I could be more than the space I'd been assigned, that freedom was something you claimed rather than requested, that the sky was big enough for everyone if you just had the courage to reach it. My phone rang, Emma's name on the screen. Where are you? Cedar Ridge, looking at the hangar my grandfather built. Can I come see it? She arrived 40 minutes later, awestruck by the space and the plane and the sense that history lived here. This is amazing. Does it still fly? If I do the pre-flight inspection and the engine checks out, probably. Want to help me find out? We spent the afternoon going through every system, checking every part, running diagnostics on equipment that was decades old but maintained with love. By evening, we determined the Cessna would fly with minor repairs and a fresh inspection certificate. Emma volunteered to help with the work, hungry for hands-on experience with aircraft maintenance. Over the next month, we restored the plane together, replaced worn parts, updated avionics where necessary, cleaned and polished until it looked like the memory I carried rather than the reality time had created. Emma learned how metal fatigues, how control surfaces wear, how engines tell you what they need if you listen carefully. The day we finished, mid-April, with spring finally winning its war against winter, we took it up. Emma flying first officer, me in command but mostly watching. She executed takeoff smoothly, climbed to altitude, ran through basic maneuvers with competence that had become confidence. How does she feel? Like flying a piece of history. Everything's manual, no automation to catch mistakes. You have to actually know what you're doing. That's why I learned on planes like this. They teach you that flying is a conversation between you and physics. Modern aircraft are amazing, but they can make you forget that gravity is always waiting for you to stop paying attention. We flew over Cedar Ridge, over the house I grew up in, over the cemetery where my mother and grandfather rested under stones that marked their ending, but not their influence. From 3,000 feet, everything looks smaller, neater, like a model train set where all the pieces fit together in ways that made sense from distance. Emma pointed toward town. Is that the church you went to as a kid? St. Catherine's. Yeah. Do you ever go back? To church, I mean. Number. God and I have an understanding. I don't ask him to explain why my childhood hurt, and he doesn't ask me to forgive people who never apologized. It's worked out fine. She laughed, then sobered. Do you think you'll ever really forgive your dad? I already have, mostly. Not because he deserves it, but because carrying anger is heavy, and I got tired of the weight. Forgiveness isn't about absolving him. It's about freeing myself from needing his acknowledgement to feel complete. We landed as sun started setting, golden light making the grass runway look almost magical. Emma taxied to the hangar, shut down systems with the careful attention of someone who respected machinery. On the ground, she turned to me with an expression that held question marks. I've been accepted to a training program. Advanced Certification for Mountain Flying and Emergency Procedures. It's in Colorado, starts in June, runs for 3 months. That's fantastic, Emma. You should absolutely do it. It means leaving, missing summer, not being here. I'll still be here when you get back. The sky's not going anywhere. I know, but I feel like I'm abandoning you after everything you've taught me. Emma, the whole point of teaching is preparing students to leave. If you stayed forever, I'd have failed. You going means I succeeded. She hugged me then, tight and long, the kind of hug that says goodbye even when the word hasn't been spoken. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. You changed my life, you know that, right? You changed your own life, I just showed you it was possible. That night I sat in the hangar alone, lights off, moonlight coming through the windows. The Cessna sat ready, fully fueled, inspected, capable. I could fly anywhere, do anything. The world was precisely as open as it had always been. I'd just finally claimed my right to access it. My phone buzzed. Text from Marcus. Dad had a good day, remembered you visited last week. Asked when you're coming again. I replied Tuesday, like always. Because that was the promise I'd made and would keep. Not because he remembered, but because I did. Not because it changed anything about our past, but because it shaped something about my present. The ability to show up consistently, even when the person you're showing up for can't track consistency. Even when nobody's watching to give you credit. Dignity isn't performance, it's practice. May arrived with wildflowers, turning Montana meadows into color that photography never quite captures. I visited Dad every Tuesday, sometimes finding him lucid, sometimes confused, always treating him with the respect he'd rarely given me, but desperately needed now. The nurses told me his decline was progressing, that 6 months from now he might not recognize anyone at all. On one particularly clear Tuesday, I took him outside to the facility's garden. We sat on a bench surrounded by tulips his hands would never be steady enough to plant. He watched clouds move across sky with the absorption of someone for whom time had stopped being linear. Katie! Yes, Dad? I'm scared. I know. Not of dying, of forgetting who I am before I'm done being myself. That's already happening, isn't it? He nodded, tears tracking down weathered cheeks. I keep losing pieces. Yesterday, I couldn't remember what Grace looked like. I know I loved her, but her face is just gone. I pulled out my phone, showed him a photo I carried. Wedding picture, 1962. Both of them young and uncertain and hopeful. This is her, this is Mom. He studied it like scripture. She was so beautiful. She was, and she loved you, despite everything. That's who she was. Someone who loved even when love was hard. I don't deserve to be loved like that. None of us deserve the love we get, Dad. We just receive it and try to honor it by becoming people who might deserve it eventually. He held my hand, his grip weak but present. I'm sorry I wasn't better. I'm sorry too, for both of us. Emma left for Colorado on June 3rd. I drove her to the Billings airport, helped carry her bags to check in. She wore her pilot's uniform, looking professional and terrified and ready. 3 months, she tried to smile. I'll be back before you know it. You'll do great. Remember everything I taught you and forget everything that makes you doubt yourself. What if I fail? Then you learn from it and try again. Failure's just information, Emma. It only becomes defeat if you stop trying. She hugged me one more time, whispered thanks I didn't deserve, walked toward security without looking back. I watched until she disappeared into the crowd, felt the peculiar emptiness that comes from watching someone you invested in become independent of that investment. The hangar became my refuge that summer. I spent weekends restoring my grandfather's other planes, 3 vintage aircraft in various states of decay. Worked slowly, methodically, letting my hands learn skills my mind remembered, but my muscles had forgotten. Each repair was meditation. Each solved problem, a small victory over entropy. July brought Marcus out to visit. He'd gotten a job finally, something stable with the county assessor's office. Nothing glamorous, but steady income and benefits, and the kind of predictability his life had lacked for decades. This place looks amazing. He walked through the hangar, touching workbenches and tool racks with the reverence of someone visiting a shrine. I'd forgotten how much time we spent here as kids. You spent time here? Sure. Before Dad and I had our falling out. Grandpa taught me basic mechanics, showed me how engines worked. I wasn't good at it, but I loved being here. Why didn't you ever mention that? Same reason you didn't talk about flying, probably. Some memories hurt too much to revisit. We sat in silence, brothers finally, after 65 years of being related without being connected. I'm proud of you, Kate, for everything. For fighting for Mom's legacy, for taking care of Dad despite everything, for just being so relentlessly yourself, even when the world kept telling you to be someone else. Thank you, that means something. Can I ask you a question? Of course. Do you think Dad ever actually loved us? Or did he just love the idea of children who'd make him look good? I think he loved us the only way he knew how, which wasn't good enough, but it was all he had. Some people's capacity for love is limited by their capacity for self-acceptance. He couldn't love us well because he couldn't love himself at all. That's generous. It's honest. Generous would be pretending it didn't damage us. Honest is acknowledging the damage while refusing to let it define us. August brought news that Dad had been moved to hospice care. Not because death was imminent, but because his quality of life had deteriorated to the point where comfort mattered more than intervention. I visited him there, in a room that smelled like lavender and resignation. He didn't recognize me, called me Grace, asked when dinner would be ready, talked about needing to get back to work before his boss got angry. I played along, held his hand, let him live in whatever timeline made sense to the fragments of mind he had left. A hospice nurse found me in the hallway afterward. You're very patient with him. He's dying. Seems like the least I can do is let him die in whatever reality feels safest. Most family members can't separate who their parents were from who they've become. They stay angry even when the person they're angry at doesn't exist anymore. I stayed angry for 36 years. I don't have the energy to maintain it now that the target's disappearing. Emma returned from Colorado in September, certified in mountain flying and emergency procedures. carrying confidence like new clothing she'd grown into. We celebrated with dinner at the same Italian place, role reversal complete as she picked up the check. I learned something while I was gone. She swirled wine in her glass, considering, about why you teach the way you do. And what's that? You never tell people they're doing it wrong. You just keep showing them what right looks like until they figure out the difference themselves. That's harder than correcting mistakes, but it builds actual understanding instead of just compliance. Teaching's just flying with a different cargo. You're still responsible for getting people from where they are to where they need to be, safely and with their dignity intact. I got an offer from the regional carrier, chief training officer for new hires. They want someone who can teach calm decision-making under pressure. Are you going to take it? I think so. But I wanted to ask your permission first. Emma, you don't need my permission to advance your career. You earned that position through your skills and character, not through my approval. Still, you're my mentor. It matters what you think. Then I think you should take it and teach those new pilots everything I taught you. Pay it forward. That's how knowledge survives. The autumn brought colors, Montana forest turning gold and red before settling into the gray that precedes winter. Dad's condition stabilized at a new baseline. Not better, but no longer actively declining. He existed in perpetual present, each moment isolated from the ones before and after. On my Tuesday visits, I started bringing photo albums, showing him pictures of a life he no longer remembered living. Sometimes he recognized faces. Sometimes he made up stories about strangers who happened to be his parents, his wife, his younger self. One October afternoon, lucid for maybe 10 minutes, he looked at me with clarity that felt borrowed from a future he wouldn't have. You're a good daughter, Katie. Better than I deserved. You're my father. The good or bad of deserving doesn't really enter into it. I wish I'd been proud of you when it mattered. You're proud of me now. That's something. Is it enough? The question hung between us, complicated and honest. It has to be. We don't get to rewrite history. We only get to decide how we interpret it going forward. He died 3 weeks later, peacefully in sleep, his brain finally giving up its fight against the plaque and tangles that had been stealing him in pieces. Marcus called at 6 in the morning. I drove to the hospice, signed papers, made decisions about funeral arrangements that felt simultaneously important and meaningless. The service was small. A handful of his old work colleagues, some people from his retirement community, Marcus and me, Emma, Victoria, Sterling. We buried him next to my mother in Cedar Ridge Cemetery, under a stone that read simply, Jonathan Mitchell, 1938 to 2024, husband and father. After everyone left, I stood alone at the grave, didn't cry, didn't pray, just acknowledged that the man who defined my childhood by his absence of acceptance had finally accepted the ultimate absence. You did your best. I spoke to the stone, to the ground, to whatever remained of him in memory and earth. It wasn't good enough, but I forgive you anyway. Not because you earned it, but because I'm tired of carrying anger toward someone who doesn't exist anymore. The wind picked up, cold and clean, carrying the smell of coming snow. I turned to leave, saw Emma waiting by my truck at a respectful distance. She didn't ask if I was okay, just opened the passenger door and got in, understanding that sometimes presence matters more than questions. We drove back to Billings in silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of things that don't need speaking. At my apartment, she finally talked. What happens now? Now I go back to living. Teaching, flying, existing in the life I built instead of the one someone else designed for me. Are you sad? I'm relieved. Sad that it had to end this way, relieved that it finally ended. Grief is complicated when the person you're grieving never became who you needed them to be. She nodded, understanding. Do you regret coming back? Fighting for the inheritance, dealing with all of it? No, because it wasn't about the money or the property or even about him. It was about honoring my mother's wishes and proving to myself that silence doesn't mean surrender, that you can be quiet and still be powerful, that you can refuse to participate in someone else's narrative without becoming invisible. That's what you taught me, the difference between being silent and being silenced. Exactly. One is choice, the other is oppression. I chose silence because it gave me space to think, to plan, to act with intention rather than reaction. He tried to silence me because my voice threatened his control. Those are completely different things. The trust fund, minus Dad's care expenses, left Marcus and me each with $400,000. He used his share to buy a small house, establish an emergency fund, finally achieve the stability he'd chased for 6 decades. I put mine back into the trust, designated for flight school scholarships for women and underrepresented minorities in Montana. Named it the Grace Mitchell Memorial Fund, because the best way to honor someone's memory is to multiply their belief in possibility. Winter settled in fully by December, snow and cold that made Montana feel like the edge of the world. Emma's new position started in January, taking her to Denver, where the regional carrier's main training facility operated. We had dinner one last time before she left, not celebrating, but acknowledging. I'm scared I'll forget everything you taught me. You won't forget. It's in your muscles now, in your instincts. That's what real teaching does. It rewires how you think until the lessons become invisible, because they're just part of who you are. Will you visit in Denver? Maybe. Or maybe you'll come back here sometimes and we'll fly together, mentor and student both checking each other's assumptions. I'd like that. So would I. She left on a Tuesday, the same day I usually visited Dad. Habit kept me driving to Cedar Ridge anyway. Found myself at the cemetery instead of the care facility. Stood between my parents' graves, looking at stones that marked endings but not meanings. Mom, Dad, I think we're done now. Whatever debts existed between us, they're settled. You gave me what you could, withheld what you couldn't manage to offer, and I survived it all. That's the victory. Not changing who you were, but becoming who I am despite your limitations. The sun was setting, turning snow to gold and shadows to purple. I walked back to my truck, drove home to Billings, to my apartment with its view of the river and its careful lack of excess. That night, I stood at the window watching water flow beneath ice, thinking about all the years I'd flown above landscapes that held stories I'd never know, all the people I'd protected who'd never know my name, all the quiet victories that mattered precisely because they didn't require applause. Silent Wings. The name had followed me for 3 decades, a call sign earned through presence rather than performance, through staying when others left, through understanding that the most powerful thing you can do is exactly what needs doing without demanding recognition for doing it. Tomorrow, I would teach a new group of students. Next week, I would fly to Denver to visit Emma's training center, see what she'd built from the foundation I'd helped lay. Next month, I would approve the first scholarships from Mom's Memorial Fund, sending other women into skies their families probably told them they didn't belong in. But tonight, I was just Kate Mitchell, 62 years old, standing in an apartment that held exactly as much as I needed, and nothing more. Daughter of a woman who'd loved fiercely and a man who'd loved poorly. Granddaughter of someone who understood that the greatest gift is wings and the faith to use them. Sister to a man who'd finally found his footing. Mentor to a pilot who'd learned that silence isn't absence of voice but choice about when voice matters. The river kept flowing, the city kept breathing, and I kept standing there, exactly where I needed to be, exactly who I'd spent 6 decades becoming, finally at peace with the truth that had always existed beneath the noise. I never needed anyone's permission to fly. I just needed to stop asking for it. That was the lesson. The one my mother tried to teach, my grandfather demonstrated, my father couldn't understand. The one I'd spent a lifetime learning and would spend whatever remained sharing. That dignity isn't given or earned or won, it's claimed. That respect isn't requested or begged for or proven. It's demanded by the simple act of refusing to accept anything less. That silence isn't weakness or fear or submission. It's power dressed in patience, strength that doesn't need to announce itself because it knows its own weight. The phone rang one last time. Sterling's number. I answered. Colonel, just checking in, making sure you're all right after everything. I'm more than all right. I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be. That's all any of us can hope for. His voice carried warmth and finality, the sound of a conversation finding its natural ending. If you ever need anything, Colonel Mitchell, you know where to find me. I do. And Sterling, thank you for seeing me when everyone else was looking through me. Some people are worth seeing. You're one of them. We said goodbye, and I set the phone down, returned to the window one last time. The river flowed, The stars emerged. The world continued turning, indifferent to my story, but somehow made richer by the fact that I'd lived it on my own terms. I'd lost a father who'd never learned to see me. I'd gained a life built on foundations he couldn't shake. I'd spent 36 years being silent because silence gave me space to become undeniable. And now, at 62, I'd finally arrived at the truth that had been waiting all along. Wings don't ask permission, they just fly. And the sky, infinite and patient and honest, catches everyone who trusts it enough to leap.